Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Dr. Randall Balmer. Dr. Balmer is an Episcopal priest, a New York Times bestselling author, and teaches religion in North America at Dartmouth College. He's a CNN contributor, the author of more than a dozen books, and his commentaries appear in newspapers across the country. In 2024, the American Academy of Religion gave him the Martin E. Marty Award for the Public Understanding of Religion. Dr. Balmer holds the John Phillips Chair in Religion at Dartmouth College, which is Dartmouth's oldest endowed professorship. He previously taught as professor of American religious history at Columbia University for 27 years, and he's been a visiting professor at Princeton, Yale Divinity, Northwestern, Emory, and in the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. In his scholarship, Dr. Balmer focuses on Christianity's interrelationships with American politics. He's written widely on this topic in books such as God in the White House, How Faith Shaped the Presidency from John F. Kennedy to George W. Bush, and also The Making of Evangelicalism, from Revivalism to Politics and Beyond. And then also My Eyes Have Seen the Glory, a journey into the evangelical subculture in America, the latter being adapted into an award-winning documentary for PBS. Today, we're going to focus on two of his other books. One is Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right, and the other is Saving Faith, How American Christianity Can Reclaim Its Prophetic Voice. And you can learn more about all of Dr. Balmer's work at randallbalmer.com. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Balmer. It's really an honor, and many congratulations on all of your important work.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
So first of all, what else would you like folks to know about you?
I think you covered quite a bit of that. I have two sons, a wonderful wife, and a grandson. Let's leave it there.
There you go. I hope you're spending more time with them these days.
Well, that's the idea.
So before we get to the two books that I mentioned that we're going to go into detail, can you talk a little bit about the other more recent books?
The more recent book it's called America's Best Idea, The Separation of Church and State. And it's really meant to be a response to this whole wave of so-called Christian nationalism, which I'm not sure is very Christian, frankly. But looking at the history of the separation of church and state in American life, arguing that the First Amendment, with its prohibition against religious establishment, that is a state church, has served two functions in American society. First, I think it has shielded the government, the political structure from religious contestation on the one hand, and on the other hand, it has ensured a vibrant, vital, salubrious religious culture in the United States, which arguably is unmatched anywhere in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so those who want to whittle away at this wall of separation between church and state, many of whom claim to be Christians, and I'm not, judging that one way or another. I don't engage in that sort of speculation. They're really undermining the faith. They're undermining what has helped to make the United States an extraordinarily religious culture and religious society. So my argument is that the separation of church and state has worked both ways. That is, it's protected the government from religious factionalism, and it has ensured a very vibrant religious culture in America, unmatched arguably anywhere in the world. And so I look at, I refute these erroneous statements that the founders intended to make a Christian nation and all this stuff, and look through the history of this, the various attempts to undermine the First Amendment, beginning with the National Reform Association during the Civil War, all the way up to the present.
Well, one of the most ridiculous aspects of that to me is how obvious, if you look at the world's history, that the lack of separation of church and state is ridiculously detrimental.
That's a bad idea. No,
I,
and part of my argument too is that the founders were well aware of that. The founders really were well aware
yes.
of the religious wars in Europe, the wars of religion in France, the English Revolution, and they wanted to avoid that. And they decided to embark on an utterly new idea in Western society to construct a government without the interlocking buttress of religion. And, again, our history as the United States goes back more than 200 years now. Now we're approaching 250 years this year, actually. And, it's worked very well. I mean, it's not to say there haven't been moments of conflict. Sure, there have, but overall, it's worked very well. And why anyone, let alone people of faith, would want to undermine it is, to me, a mystery.
Yes, yes, it's crazy, just craziness. All right, so let's get to the books that I mentioned. The first one, Bad Faith, Race and Rise of the Religious Right. How did that book come about?
In 2014, Politico asked me to write an article about the origins of the religious right, which is something I'd been looking at and researching for some time at that point. And so I wrote it. I wrote this article, and at one point they told me that was the most popular article they'd ever published, and I'm sure that's no longer the case, but at that time, it was. And so for years thereafter, I kept getting phone calls, probably one a week, maybe not quite that much, many once a fortnight, every 2 weeks perhaps, would get a phone call or an email from a journalist or somebody who wanted to talk to me about this. And so I decided several years later that I would combine it into a small book, that is to expand the article into a small book. And the advantage was that I was able in this small book, and as you know, it's a very short book, I was able to put all the footnotes in so that if anybody questioned my judgment or my argument, that person could go through and check my sources. And I'm confident the argument is pretty airtight. And what I argued in that book, as you know, is that the real origins of the religious right had nothing whatsoever to do with abortion and opposition to abortion. It was instead to defend racial segregation at places like Bob Jones University and various segregation academies, such as Jerry Falwell's own segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia.
Which, I didn't realize this, fact until several years ago, so, the fact that, people like you and Frank Schaeffer, right, have
Correct,
really,
yes.
written about that was certainly enlightening to me.
Can I interrupt you on that point?
Sure, sure.
We talked earlier about Wild Goose
Yes,
Festival.
yes.
Actually, that's where Frank and I were at the same Wild Goose Festival, and I made my pitch, and he came up to me afterwards. He says, "Oh, you're absolutely right. I didn't realize that." So that's where Frank um, began to understand the real origins of this movement, which of course he was intimately involved with his father.
Yeah, I mean, his story is another just amazing
Sure, it is
thing in
fascinating.
terms of, so you didn't really know him before his quote unquote conversion out of that far
Obviously,
right world.
obviously, I knew who he was, but we'd never met, and it was at Wild Goose where, again, I had actually he and I may have been on the same panel. I don't remember. I think we were on the same panel actually, and I put forward my argument, and he said, "Oh, that makes sense." Now it all makes sense to him.
Yeah, yeah. So back to kind of the whole, racial aspect of this thing. How did they cover that up?
Oh, I think it was brilliant the way they covered it up. And the person I credit for this, I'm not sure credit's the right word, but the person responsible for this was Paul Weyrich, who's really the architect of the religious right. And Paul Weyrich was a brilliant tactician. I mean, I think for all the wrong causes, if I may say so, but he really was quite politically astute. And he realized toward the end of the 1970s that yes, he had the beginnings of a political movement, but he also realized that it would be very difficult in the long run to mobilize these white evangelical voters in defense of racial segregation. and he needed a different issue uh, to bring about this sort of mass mobilization, which he had been dreaming about actually ever since the Goldwater campaign in 1964. And so he really stumbled on abortion as the issue that would make the difference. And the crucial moment for him was the 1978 midterm elections, when Jimmy Carter, of course, was president, an evangelical president, of course. And there were four Senate races, one in New Hampshire, one in Iowa, and the two of them in Minnesota. One of them was for the unexpired term of Walter Mondale, who, of course, was Jimmy Carter's vice president. And in those elections, well, let me back up a bit. Prior to those elections that year, Weyrich went to William Brock, who was the head of the Republican National Committee, and he wanted money to try to mobilize evangelical voters. And according to Weyrich, Brock looked across the desk at Weyrich and said, who are these people? Are you crazy? I'm not going to give you any money from this. Whereupon Weyrich, again, according to his own count, resolved to go out and elect some improbable people to the Senate in 1978. And so he focused on those four races, all of which the pundits believed that the Democratic nominees were going to win election fairly easily in all four of those races. And the final weekend of that campaign, pro-lifers, who at that time were Roman Catholics because it was not yet an evangelical issue, pro-lifers leafleted church parking lots in all four of those Senate races. 2 days later, in an election with a very low turnout, which tends to be the case in midterm elections, all four of those favored Democratic nominees lost to anti-abortion Republicans. And I remember going through Paul Weyrich's papers, which are improbably enough at the University of Wyoming in Laramie. And it's almost like around that election, the paper started to sizzle because he realized that he'd finally found the issue that was going to mobilize these white evangelical voters. So the adoption of, and then the full adoption of abortion by the religious right really didn't take hold until right before the 1980 presidential election, 2 years later. But I think getting back to your question, I think what happened is that Weyrich realized that he had to do a kind of subterfuge in order to camouflage the true origins of this movement, and to make it instead about opposition to abortion. And the other thing, and again, it was brilliant, utterly brilliant on his part. And I give him, credit. Again, it's not the right word, but I acknowledge his brilliance in this, because very quickly thereafter, this movement called itself pro-life. And who's against life? I mean, it was brilliant labeling on their part. And it worked. It worked remarkably well, and it helped to galvanize this entire movement. And I'm going to add a little footnote to that long answer. I apologize for going on and on.
No, it's very interesting. I did not realize that was the pivoting point.
That's what happened. I'm right now completing a biography of Mark Hatfield, and I don't know if you remember that name. Mark Hatfield was an evangelical, a Baptist, 30-year senator from Oregon. An extraordinary man, really someone I admire very, very much, very deeply. And arguably the last liberal Republican in America. And what I have learned in the course of writing this biography is that Mark Hatfield, this political liberal, anti-Vietnam dove, Mark Hatfield was the first prominent evangelical to come out against legalized abortion after the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973. More than 5 years before Jerry Falwell did. Again, I can get into all these arguments about why what I call the abortion myth is fiction, but it's Mark Hatfield who stood really alone for actually the better part of the decade as an evangelical opposing abortion.
Well, the reason why I am familiar with him is because of Wes Granberg
Oh,
Marshall,
sure. Yeah, sure.
right? So I've interviewed Wes for a couple of his
Of
books,
course. Yeah, of
more
course. Yeah.
recently and know him very well. But um,
He's been very helpful, by the way, in looking over my manuscript and,
I'm not surprised, and I would be
yeah.
an excellent person to do that.
Yep. And Wes,
Wow.
just for the benefit of whoever's watching or listening, Wes was a longtime aide to Mark Hatfield when he was in the Senate.
Yes, yes, yes. So would you say that abortion is still the primary driver of the religious right, or
It's a
has it
great
been
question.
superseded?
I think it's been superseded in recent years, in part because they've won. They won. The Dobbs decision represents a real victory for the anti-abortion movement, and we can talk more about whether or not that's good or not. And I don't really want to get into it at this point, but um, yeah, I think what's happened now is now that they've won on that issue, they've kind of been um, casting about, looking for a new issue. And I think that, and I speculated at the time that it was probably going to be some issue around sexuality. So whether it's trans rights or LGBT or whatever it might be, I think they're kind of casting about in some ways. But, the abortion issue, has largely been settled in this country, certainly legally. There's going to be a lot of skirmishes, certainly, uh, at the local level, the state level, but overall, the Supreme Court has decided in their favor. So I think they're looking about for a new issue.
Well, let's see if that sticks. I'm not convinced that it will in the long run, but maybe that's, as Frederick Buechner would say, wishful thinking. But in any in any event, um, so back to your book. Here's an excerpt from one of our other author friends, Jamar Tisby, who says, before you read another headline or write another social media post about religion, race, or politics, read this book. So personally speaking, it seems to me that that's really good advice because so many people just don't know about the origins and the repeated focus on racism,
Yeah.
of the evangelical right. Would you say a part of that, at least, is because racism is still so very much alive today?
I'm afraid it is. And to be honest, I resisted that conclusion for many, many years. I defended evangelicals against the charge of racism for a long, long time.
Hmm.
Um, but I have to say that the overwhelming white evangelical support for Donald Trump in the past three presidential elections, we're talking now about 4 out of 5 white evangelicals supporting Donald Trump. I came to the point where I could no longer ignore that racism was a part of that support. Uh,
Really?
yeah, and I come to that conclusion reluctantly. And as I said, I fought against it for a long time, arguing that evangelicals were not really racist. But it's pretty hard to make that argument these days.
Well, I mean, personally speaking, when Obama became president, I
Yeah,
was, somewhat hopeful, right?
sure.
That we were going to push that even further behind us.
Right.
And boy, was that a mistake?
The backlash is just,
Roaring back.
yeah, it really is. Yeah. No, I felt the same thing. And when he was elected, I mean, I never thought in my
Yeah.
lifetime that we would elect an African American president, let alone reelect him. I mean, I thought, wow, we've really turned a corner here in this country, dealing with what many historians call America's original sin, which is racism.
Yeah.
But I think the backlash is
Hmm.
more than more than amply demonstrated that we still have a lot of work to do.
Far more than I expected.
Yeah, yeah.
But anyway, let's switch gears now. Talk about the second book that I mentioned, Saving Faith, How American Christianity Can Reclaim Its Prophetic Voice. So how did that book come about?
I came in a conversation with my editor at Fortress, Kerry Newman. We
Hmm.
just started talking, and he said, I want a short book that kind of gives us hope, I guess, is what he was saying. I don't want to put words in his mouth. I don't remember exactly what he said, but what I wanted to do is do a follow-up in many ways to Bad Faith, even though they're different publishers. Bad Faith, kind of lets out the cat out of the bag, so to speak, in saying, look, it's not abortion that galvanized this movement. It was instead a defense of racial segregation, and I think that argument is airtight. Um, but I wanted to offer some hope and say, look, for evangelicals in particular and Christians generally in this country, first of all, we're in trouble. You look at the state of mainline Christianity, it's, the numbers are not, not good, not promising. The Catholic Church has had its own travails over pedophilia and other issues. And evangelicals, I think, have lost their way. And this is the movement which I feel closest to, in part because my own background. My father was an evangelical preacher for 40 years. And I honor both his ministry and his memory. I wanted to offer some hope. How do we get out of this mess? How do we try to climb out of this predicament for Christianity in America? So I wanted to go into some of the history, look at why it is that we're so drawn to nostalgia and sentimentality, talking about the good old days of the 1950s. Well, come on. Maybe for whites, you can make that argument, but for others, not so much. And try to point a way forward. And as a historian, the way forward is to look back at the past and say, what was there that we can reappropriate? What can we learn from the past? And so that the book was an attempt to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that you talk about are some, as you call, misguided remedies that have been tried. You want to touch on some of those?
Oh, you have to remind me. I don't have the book in front of me. What did I say?
There were several different things that you talked about, in terms of
yeah, one was nostalgia, I think.
Yeah.
And I talked about the number of people, the number of Americans who visit Mount Airy, North Carolina every year, which is kind of the mythical home of the Andy Griffith Show, which aired in the late 50s, early 60s, as I recall. Looking to the past and trying to recover something that was lost. I think that's a powerful motivation for a lot of these folks on the political stage these days. And I tried to say, well, wait a minute, maybe it wasn't quite so idyllic as we want to imagine it to be. That was part of it. The whole impulse to declare the United States a Christian nation, this Christian nationalism movement, and say emphatically that was not the case. And so I look at some of the founders and say, are you really going to try to make Benjamin Franklin into an evangelical Christian, as David Barton wants to do, or Thomas Jefferson, or whoever it might be? That's not only bad history, that's wishful thinking, let's put it that way. So those are some of the ways in which people have tried to dredge up the past in order to buttress their prescription for the future, and I think that's misguided.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So one of the things I really like about that book is that you not only analyze the problem, you also address the question, what do we do about it?
Yeah.
I wish all books had that kind of focus, quite frankly. What are some of the suggestions that you?
Well, I think the big suggestion was that Christians in America, and I guess I probably gave undue emphasis to evangelicalism because that's part of my DNA. It's part of who I am. I think Christians in America need to recover their prophetic voice. And we've lost that. We've lost that prophetic voice, certainly with the religious right. And the prophetic voice, I think, again, looks to the past, in this case, not to the 1950s, but maybe a century earlier, to say, look, this is a movement that really was quite remarkable and quite noteworthy. in the early part of the 19th century in particular for its advocacy for those Jesus would call the least of these. So you had evangelicals who were involved in the prison reform movement. You had evangelicals who were involved in the formation of public education, known as common schools in the 19th century, because they recognized that was the way for those on the lower rungs of society to improve their lot, to become upwardly mobile. You had evangelicals who were very much in favor of women's equality at a time, arguing at the time for voting rights for women, considered very radical at the time. You had evangelicals who were involved in peace crusades, and evangelicals in the North, at least, who were advocating for an end to slavery. So these are quite notable movement impulses that I think contemporary evangelicals can look back to and say, let's try to appropriate this noble impulse in our past. And that I also suggest that part of that looking to the past means going even further, going back to the New Testament and the words of Jesus. How about that? Jesus was pretty clear about taking care of widows and orphans and
strangers in our midst.
Strangers in our midst, to welcome the stranger. I mean, shouldn't that have, I understand international borders are a vexed issue, but it seems to me that a declaration like that would have some bearing on contemporary attitudes toward refugees, for example. So that's what I was trying to argue, is that overall that Christians in America needed to recover their prophetic voice, which I think has been lost now for arguably decades. And part of the way to do that is to go back not only to the New Testament and the words of Jesus, but also to their own history and say, look, this is a movement that has a pretty distinguished pedigree and a noble legacy that we need to reappropriate.
So one of the benefits of the work I've been doing over the past few years is being able to hear from, read from, learn from several writers of color that I think are pretty strong prophetic voices. Sure. They're not listened to as much as they should be. In fact, I know that this is the case. Right. But, for me, that is a strong strain of prophetic voice that still exists and has been strong.
That's right. Yeah, that is. No, absolutely. The Black church is really quite a remarkable part of our history. And I think you're absolutely right. We need to be listening to those voices. Actually, that was one of the criticisms, one of the reviews of the book, and I think it's a legitimate criticism, is that I didn't invoke those voices more than I did. And I regret that. If I were rewriting the book, I would certainly include explicitly more of those voices. I think I represented their arguments, but didn't give them explicit credit for those arguments.
Well, there's an opportunity for another book.
How about that? At some point, I'm going to stop writing.
Well, I hope not soon. In any event, I'd like to read from a couple of reviews of this book. This one is from Christy Nabhan Warren, professor and chair of Catholic Studies at the University of Iowa, who says, Balmer offers us a prescription to make a sick Christianity healthy. It will cause pain in the interim, will require sacrifice, love, bridge building, and reestablishing the separation of church and state. Mm-hmm. We talked about that earlier. So I was glad to hear that you had a book. I didn't realize that one book that you mentioned, you already dealt with that pretty thoroughly. Yeah. So I think that's, tell the name of the book again so that...
It's called America's Best Idea, The Separation of Church and State. And that's the one actually that made the New York Times bestseller list. So.
Okay, cool.
It's, again, another slim volume. And frankly, I didn't realize that Christy had reviewed the book. So thank you for mentioning this. I'm not very good at reading book reviews. I should probably do more than that. I do.
Well, that's a publisher's job, so.
That's true.
To get the reviews for you.
Right.
So here's one from author E.J. Dion Jr., who says Balmer calls for prophetic Christianity that positions itself at the margins. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Again, I didn't realize that EJ had done that. Or was that a blurb?
Yeah, it's on the either Amazon or the book's
oh, is
website.
that right? Okay. Yeah.
One of the
Yeah.
two.
Yeah. EJ. Yeah, I think that's margin. I've made this argument for a long time. I think that religion functions best from the margins and not in the councils of power. That is to say that once a religious movement or a religious individual of one sort or another tries to seek um, access to power, I think that almost inevitably the prophetic voice is compromised. And I think the religious right is a very good example of that. You can make an argument that the religious right started out with very good motives, and I'm not, that's probably a larger conversation. But once they had success, that is in the 1980 presidential election, then what Jerry Falwell and others cared about was access to the White House. And so when Reagan did things that I think any Christian might question, throughout his presidency, you had no one pushing back and saying, like Nathan to David in the Hebrew Bible, maybe you shouldn't be doing this. Maybe this is not consistent with what we believe is right. And I don't want to pick on the religious right also. I think the same thing happened with mainline Protestantism up until the mid-1960s, when mainline Protestantism was more interested in access to power and even shaping public opinion than it was in offering a prophetic voice. So when EJ talks about this, I appreciate his comments, what I was trying to argue was that people of faith should remain on the margins. And this is actually Jacques Ellul as well. I mean, Jacques Ellul argues that a Christian should always be outside the circle of power. And even if there's a change in regimes or administrations or whatever it might be, that immediately the Christian comes at the whole conversation from the outside rather than from the inside.
Hmm. So we touched on this a minute ago, but I have to ask you, I know you're in the middle of, watching books and things, but do you have any future books coming up that you
I
can tell us about?
I have, well, the big book right now is this biography of Mark Hatfield, and this is something I've been thinking about actually arguably since the 1960s when I was a college student, or 70s at least. And I admired him because he was a prophetic voice really throughout his career. So that's the big project. I have a kind of side project that is rather offbeat from our conversation. I'm writing a coffee table book on the Catholic basilicas in the United States. There are
Huh,
93 of them.
wow.
And so far I've visited 83, I believe, maybe 84.
Wow.
And so I'm putting that together. I got a few more to go and hope to be putting that together. Beyond that, I don't know. I, I don't know if I'm gonna how many more books I have. We'll see. I've got an idea for a novel. I may kind of
Oh
switch
my.
that. We'll see. We'll see.
Well, I hope there are more. I mean, you're just
Thank
too
you. That's
important
very
of a
kind.
voice, that needs to continue to, be prophetic.
Well, thank you. I take that seriously, and I appreciate that sentiment because it's important to do that. And a lot of my writing now is also doing newspaper op-eds and commentaries and things like that, which kind of keeps me attuned to current
Good,
affairs.
good, good. Well, thanks again for joining us, Dr. Balmer, and thanks so much for all the incredible work that you've done. We really appreciate that, and well, more people can benefit from it.
You're very kind. Thank you. I appreciated the conversation.
Well, check out all of his work at randallbalmer.com, and thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.